Today we're going to cover the rest of chapter 18. There's a lot of detail in chapter 18, and we're not going to dwell on all of those details. As I've done in most of the passages, we're not going to dwell on those details. We're going to just push right through them, recognizing that chapter 18 fits into a larger section that's introduced in chapter 15, where God's presence was manifest in the temple in heaven. No one could enter the temple. Only God was there. The smoke of His presence filled the temple. And then a voice came from it, commissioning these 7 angels to dump out 7 bowls on earth. Each bowl represented a different aspect of God's wrath on earth's inhabitants. After the last bowl was emptied, one of the angels who had dumped a bowl came to John to show him what was going to happen to the great prostitute. And as the scene unfolds, the evidence mounts that this great prostitute that was described is the same one referred to as Babylon and the great city. She seems to represent unfettered sexual expression, general immorality, and greedy self-gratification that has consumed humanity's attention throughout time. These conclusions depend on what is revealed of her in chapter 17 and then also in chapter 18. Chapter 18 expands on the sparse mention of God's judgment on her carried out, ironically, by those who had benefited from how she had distracted the world. We only looked at the beginning of chapter 18 last week, the first 8 verses, where we found the first major section where judgment was pronounced. And then following that, the next major section where we'll look today is how the world responds to that judgment, which is followed in turn by heaven's response, pronouncing a time to rejoice, which we'll also consider today. Now, many scholars believe that Babylon will be a rebuilt city, and we are to thus read the judgment that's applied here, applying it to a literal place on earth where the ancient city once stood. Now, I've not said anything about that to this point, mainly because of the emphasis in what we've seen so far on the evil practices of the one here portrayed. The nature of the behavior repeated so many times here could be applied to any number of places or people on earth, and many have been suggested that could fit this description of Babylon. Some scholars point to her similar traits as the apostate church. Others see similarities to the city of Rome. Now, I would ask you to suspend your own preconceived notions as to who or what she represents and just observe the text today. It's neither my goal, nor I don't think it's necessarily my job to convince you of the superiority of one view over another. Having examined the first section of this passage last week in which the judgment is pronounced, let's see what we can learn from the next section in which the world responds to God's judgment on her. The world's response is considered from the perspective of 3 major groups. First is that of the kings of earth, which we would look at as being the governments and the politicians and the politics of the world. Verse 9, chapter 18, Revelation. And the kings of the earth, who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her, will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. So first, the voice describes their loss. Now, their loss is my interpretation of the things that are listed, which seem to be the reason for their sadness. They're said to have committed sexual immorality with her. Now, either the angel had declared that the kings of the earth had committed immorality with Babylon the Great, but it was only implied that it was immorality of a general nature. But here he identifies it as sexual immorality. Earlier, it was only the nations of earth who were accused of this, of sexual immorality. But now the kings are implicated in this failure as well. Now, unless we try to force Babylon the Great to be an actual woman, This sexual immorality with her must symbolize something. In some way, the kings of the earth have partnered intimately with this and derived physical satisfaction and pleasure from her, just like the nations they've ruled. This conclusion is confirmed by the additional revelation that they have lived in luxury with her. Earth's kings and rulers have enjoyed an extravagantly comfortable lifestyle from their partnership with this. In the first description of the sins of the kings of the earth, this was not listed either. This was the accusation against... Wow. Okay, so we still got a problem there. See, this is what happened last Sunday, too. Something's messed up with our sound system. So, I don't know if I've got your attention, but I've got my attention. The merchants of the earth had this accusation made against them at the beginning of chapter 18. The implication is that all three groups of people are involved in all the categories of sins. As I said last week, I believe they have been so throughout history. It will just expand to even greater levels just before this final destruction. Their losses will be felt deeply. And the angel tells John about their response next. They will have grown immensely wealthy as a result of their partnership and cooperation with this. When it all comes crashing down around them, all they will be able to do is to weep. They sob openly and wail. John MacArthur describes this as expressing despair. There will no doubt be a sense of bewilderment when that upon which they've relied for their lavish lifestyle suddenly crumbles. They will not, however, run to save it. Instead, recognizing the danger and the need for self-preservation, they will simply stand far off. Social distancing, right? The reason for distancing from her is given in no uncertain terms. They will do so in fear of her torment. They may long for the niceties they have enjoyed because of her, but they want nothing to do with the torment in which she will be. The best they can do is to bemoan, crying that in a single hour her judgment has come. And more precisely and specifically, they say, "Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come." Their cries are sincere that the great source of income and commerce and wealth and self-gratification has come to an end. They seem to be shocked at the swiftness of this judgment that came, they said, in a single hour. This is not to suggest that it took a mere 60 minutes for this to happen, although that could be the case. The point is not the increment of time involved, but how quickly it happened. This is a point at which it becomes evident that this must represent something more than a system, as I have suggested in the past. It's difficult to imagine a system being judged apart from the people who are part of that system. A city or a nation could be judged, and there are many such which could fit this description. This is why many scholars insist that it must be a literal rebuilt Babylon. But let's not try to make any conclusive calls on that just yet. Having described how the kings of earth will respond, the voice from heaven tells how the second major group of world players will respond. The business sector, described in this passage as merchants. Verse 11, "And the merchants of earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots and slaves," that is, human souls, The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. Thinking back to Jesus' address to the 7 churches at the beginning of Revelation, this is similar to the issue the church at Laodicea had. Jesus warned them and believers in all churches. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 15, Jesus said, I know your works. He's talking to Laodicea here. You are neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you're lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. He says, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire so that you may be rich, and white garments so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes so that you may see. Those whom I love I reprove and discipline. So be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, and he with me. The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Now I have the last verse on the screen behind me because of this. This is specifically addressed to one church in particular that was dealing with this problem, the church at Laodicea. But the closing words are instructions to hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. To the church, that is to say, you who comprise the church, Jesus gave you warning. Don't become so consumed with acquiring stuff or living comfortably that you neglect the weightier matters of life. The spiritual things. This inevitably leads Christians who leads to Christians who go through life, go through the motions of appearing Christian, but the true God of their lives is self-satisfaction. Jesus warned that he would spit you out of his mouth if you don't sell out to him. Get off the fence. Either be cold or hot. But quit this nonsense of playing in the world and dabbling in the world and trying to appear to be a Christian. Jesus said, I will spew you out of my mouth. I like how the King James translates it as spew you out of my mouth. Which spit, at least in our understanding, spit doesn't really convey what spew does. Some translators, some translate it vomit. There's an emphasis of force there. That he's going to get you out of his mouth. Jesus is serious about this problem amongst believers in his church. Now, of course, those in the scene before us are not believers, though they could possibly be members of some sort of an apostate church. These are men and women of the corporate world who have enjoyed great wealth from their trade of physical goods, including even the trade of humans. With nobody buying their wares anymore, they're out of business, which elicits their response, which is the same as the world's rulers who lost their lifestyles as well. They weep and they mourn. And then the voice from heaven provides an extensive and detailed description of their loss. We can't overlook this list of 28 things. It's significant that he puts this here. And it can be broken down to 7 or 8 categories. And I have those listed. I didn't even put them on the outline that you've got. And by the way, if you haven't, if you're watching this online, you can download that outline at our website, bbccv.org/sermons, and you can find today's message. You can download this outline, but you won't find this list on that outline. It's just too much. It's 28 different things, but you can break it down to 7 or 8 categories. Jewelry, materials of rich attire, materials for costly furniture, precious spices, food items, livestock, military equipment, human trafficking. Now, I think this list is here, and it's extensive because it's intended to convey that every aspect of commercial trade will be cut off. Now, we've had, as I'm recording this in 2020, we've been in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic that's going on, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so we've had a little taste of what this is like, as so much of the world's commerce and commercial trade has been cut off. It's interesting to me that writing in the late 1740s, John Gill, a Reformed Baptist minister and commentator from England, said this about this list. He said, "This list is not to be understood merely in a literal sense. For such commodities in general as are there mentioned, if they do not sell at one place, they will sell at another. And the decline of trade in one city does not put a stop to business all the world over. And often so it is, that the ruin of commerce in one place is the rise of it in another." That was in 1740 that John Gill wrote that. Now, he could just as well have written that a year ago, and it would have been true. We've become quite accustomed to being able to find any item we need or want, if not at one location, at another. And with the advent of the internet and online sales, we can literally, if we can't find it in one country, we can find it in another country. We can find it on Amazon, right? Anything's on Amazon. And if we can't get it there, we can get it someplace else. We're accustomed to looking elsewhere, just as John Gill talked about in 1740. But the past few months have opened our eyes to the possibility that indeed it is not out of the question to be unable to purchase or sell certain goods. Now, granted, we haven't seen anything as extensive as this list that's here in Revelation, but who would have thought a year ago that there would be a nationwide shortage of something like toilet paper, of all things? The whole world is currently experiencing just a little taste of what is to come. When Babylon falls, whatever it represents, commercial trade will be brought to a screeching halt. It will be, in every sense of the word, unprecedented. The list of goods provided demonstrates that they will impact non-essential items which are consumed upon the lusts of men and women. The materialistic mindset of the great prostitute embedded in the hearts and activities of so many people will matter no more. As I said, we've seen in the past few months, dealing with the worldwide pandemic of coronavirus, just a little taste of what that will be like. However, it won't just be non-essential products that are impacted. This list also includes, notice, essential items to life. But regardless of the essential nature of the things people try to amass, there comes a heavenly declaration that greed for more will no longer be satisfied. The translation from Greek to English obscures the double negative used here. The voice from heaven declares, "The fruit for which your soul has longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again." The Greek language used here captures the negative impact, never to be found again, in a way the English doesn't convey. Perhaps we could say, never to be found again, ever, ever, ever. The emphasis here is emphatic. These things will never be found again, ever. There's a finality about this, making the adjective unprecedented that we throw around so the past few months because of COVID-19 take on whole new meaning. Indeed, this will be unprecedented. There's another element we can miss because we don't read Greek. Actually, the thing that obscures it more than the translation difficulties is how I've demonstrated it in the structure in my outline of the text. The way I've organized my outline, if you'll note, It hides the emphasis of the literary device John seems to have used that puts this heavenly declaration in the middle of what's called a chiasm. Even in my outline, you can see this is the middle point of the section. It's an unexpected break in the action that's preceded by kings mourning and merchants listing their losses, and followed by merchants mourning and mariners mourning. And right in the middle of this is this odd sentence, separated in our English translations by quotation marks. Note, we start with these monarchs mourn, verses 9 and 10. Then merchants list their losses, that we just read in verses 11 to 13. And then there's verse 14, this death announcement in quotation marks that I just read to you. And then the merchants mourn. And then the mariners mourn. This seems to be done intentionally, putting this heavenly declaration in the middle of what's called this chiasm. Now, some translators will add the word "they will say" where this quotation mark, where this quotation comes. They will say, "The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you," implying that the merchants have said that. But when we identify the structure as the intended chiasm, it becomes clear that this is a statement at the center of the chiasm, and actually becomes then the main point of this section. We therefore conclude that it is a dramatic interruption from the heavenly voice on verse 4. It becomes then central to our understanding of the purpose and meaning of the text. It is a message from God. To recall the warning from Jesus to the church at Laodicea that preceded this is absolutely proper. There is, I believe, a warning inherent in this to the church in the first century through to today. I think the words John penned in his first epistle in 1 John chapter 2 are appropriate here. 1 John 2:15. John says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride and the possessions, is not from the Father, but it is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." So if you get too caught up in the wealth of the world and indulging in the good things the world has to offer, you will eventually become disappointed. If that becomes your driving force in life, you will be disappointed. And Jesus warned the church at Laodicea that it sickens him. This view of its final judgment indicates that it will be judged and done away with altogether. There are ample reasons to not get sucked into the materialism that motivates most people. This is the heart of the message. But the chiasm returns to the description as it details the response then of the merchants. It's just like that of the kings seen before this. They too stand far off for the same reason. They're afraid of the torment of Babylon. They don't want to get sucked into that. And their response is the same too, in as much as they cry out, weeping and mourning. And they mourn that in a single hour all the wealth has been laid waste. Just as with the kings, this mourning has nothing to do with concern for Babylon, whether from a sense of patriotism or loyalty, but strictly from a point of their own self-interest and loss of revenue and lifestyle. It's the same reason they keep their distance as they observe the destruction. This motivation is clearly seen in the statement in verse 16 when they say, "Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste." They're clearly brokenhearted over the loss of their ability to gain wealth. Suddenly, all their retirement funds fail. Their valuable merchandise is worthless. Like the stock market crash of 1929, in a moment, the entire booming economy, not just of one country, but of the entire world this time, grinds to a halt. Once again, what we've seen this year is just a sample of what this will be like. There's one more group whose response is documented. The final group mentioned is the shipmasters and sailors. Verse 17, the second part of verse 17 goes on, "And all the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off, and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning, What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads, and as they wept, and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste." Just like the kings and the merchants described before them, we find here the response now of the shipmasters and the sailors, those responsible for transportation. They too stood far off. They did so as they watched the smoke of Babylon's burning. And they cried out as they watched the smoke, "Oh, what city was like that great city? How could it be? How could this be going up in smoke?" So they mourned their loss, the source of their wealth, because in a single hour, again emphasizing the speed at which this will come, has been laid waste. Like the merchants who lost their ability to sell their goods, now those who were transporting those goods, suddenly they have nothing to transport and no place to transport it to. It's in slightly different terms than the previous two, but again, this contributes to the chiasm, which intends to emphasize the quotation at its center. But as further reminder that this contains a message for believers, the passage closes with pronouncing a time to rejoice. Verse 20. "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." Note, that's an instruction. Rejoice. They're told to rejoice because God has given judgment against her. Verse 21, "Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon the Great be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine will shine in you no more. For your merchants, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by her sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slain on the earth." This proclamation, again, is directed to those in heaven in the future when Babylon's destruction finally comes to pass. It is nonetheless reason for hope and even rejoicing for saints living in a society today that's still under the influence of Babylon's seduction. Thus, verse 20 declares that the saints and apostles and prophets have reason to rejoice because of God's judgment. Not only do they have reason to, they're told to rejoice because of God's judgment. Christians standing up today warning of the coming destruction for those who continue to embrace the seductive lifestyle of materialism, sexual perversion, and wanton immorality will rejoice in heaven when their prophetic proclamations come to pass in God's righteous judgment. But we will witness this from the safety of heaven, to be sure. And we will witness Babylon's fall from there. In the Old Testament, Babylon's destruction was predicted by Jewish prophets who foretold of her destruction, despite the fact that God had used Babylon as an instrument to punish his own people for their infidelity to him. It was then a literal city and kingdom at that time. Observe the words of Jeremiah's prophecy recorded in Jeremiah chapter 51. Jeremiah 51 verse 60. Jeremiah wrote in a book all the disaster that should come upon Babylon, all these words that are written concerning Babylon. And Jeremiah said to Sariah, "When you come to Babylon, see that you read all these words, and say, O Lord, you have said concerning this place that you will cut it off, so that nothing shall dwell in it, neither man nor beast, and it shall be desolate forever." Sounds a lot like what we just read in Revelation, doesn't it? Verse 63, when you finish reading this book, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates, and say, thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more, because of the disaster that I am bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. Jeremiah's words of warning to a city consumed with the very same things the Babylon of John's vision are consumed. Indeed, when Babylon fell, according to Jeremiah's prophecy, it never again rose from the ashes, just as he predicted. It's one of the arguments against a literal rebuilt city of Babylon being in view in what John saw. At any rate, the imagery of Jeremiah was told to employ upon the proclamation of his prophecy against Babylon is interesting in light of Revelation 18:21. Jeremiah told Sariah, he said, when you finish reading this book, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates and say, thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more, because of the disaster that I am bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted. And in Revelation, when this angel throws a millstone in the sea, verse 21, the angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon the Great be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. So are we to picture a literal giant millstone flying down from heaven and crashing into the sea, and a tidal wave inundating Babylon and destroying it? I don't think so. It doesn't make any sense in light of what we've read in Revelation. But the word that clues us in that it's not to be taken literally is the word so. It's translated from the Greek word huto, meaning in this manner. It's clearly intended to be symbolic, like Sariah tying a stone to the book he read and throwing it into the Euphrates River. What Sariah did was predictive of what was going to happen later on. But it was played out in Jeremiah's day when Babylon was destroyed, never to rise again. But now, here in Revelation, we've already seen that happen. In Jeremiah saw that happen. The Israelites saw that happen. It's happened, but here again, now we draw on that imagery and we say it's going to happen when this symbolic Babylon is destroyed in the same way the literal city and kingdom of Babylon was destroyed thousands of years earlier. The question remains, is Babylon also symbolic, like this millstone and this image? Or are we to take it to be literal? In his 2010 book, The Coming Economic Armageddon, David Jeremiah points out that in 1987, Saddam Hussein set out to rebuild Babylon and portrayed himself as the new Nebuchadnezzar. And efforts to rebuild Babylon to its former ancient glory have continued to various degrees since then. Thus, many contend that we should expect to see a literal rebuilt city of Babylon. But even if that is the case, and I'm not going to land one way or another on whether it is or it isn't, but even if it is, the immorality that Babylon represents is the real focus here. That immorality has ruled the world in some form or fashion throughout most of human history. It is guilty of the slaying of untold millions of faithful believers during those centuries, during those millennia, throughout time. Her final judgment is imminent, and it will be thorough, which fact is seen in the angel's declaration, as the angel describes now the results of Babylon's fall. He says that there will be found in her no more music, no more craftsmen, no more manufacturing, no more light, no more marriage or celebrations. The picture is clear. All the things that constitute normal human life and vitality are gone. And again, we've seen, I think, a foreshadowing and a little taste of what that's going to be like in the last several months. As you've driven down once bustling cities, that the streets are empty. Who would have ever imagined New York City being empty of people in the streets? How could that be? No music, no craftsmen, no manufacturing, no light, no celebrations, no marriages, and all these things. I mean, good grief, you can't even do a wedding in some places right now. This is a taste, a little foreshadowing of what is going to come. And finally, he gives then the reasons for Babylon's judgment. He says it's because of her influence on the commercial giants' practices. It's also because of her influence on the world's nations. And it's also because she's guilty of slaying Old Testament prophets, New Testament saints, and others. The world, pursuing easy living, lax morality, and pleasure, will eventually be judged for their obstinance. And some Christians have been duped into that mindset. The seemingly satisfying fruit of those pursuits will end in destruction. Those Christians who have been and will continue to be mowed down by those same people who perpetuate this lifestyle and these attitudes and these actions. Those same people who have mowed many Christians down in the past and even to today. Those Christians who have been mowed down by that will be called on to rejoice when judgment is doled out. It is again an encouragement, as we've seen before. It's an encouragement to faithfulness, to be faithful, to hang in there as a believer. When the world hates and mocks and persecutes us for rejecting the accepted norms, whatever they may be, and they're constantly changing. And by the way, they're becoming more and more against Christianity and against Christians, even in nations once considered to be quote-unquote Christian. But there's also in this, beside that encouragement to hang in there, as we've seen before, there's a warning not to be consumed by the things the world has to offer. Because those things will be lost fruit. It will bemoan the loss of their fruit. The fruit for which your soul has longed will be gone from you. And all your delicacies and all your splendors are lost to you, never, ever, ever to be found again. So how dare we as Christians long for those things, those delicacies the world has to offer, the immoralities, sexual and otherwise, that the world has to offer and tries to justify and explain away and even use scriptures to justify. The fruit for which your soul has longed has gone from you. That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen to the unbelievers. They're going to be suddenly disappointed, dramatically so, but guess what? I believe that God sends foreshadowings and tastes and types and shadows of those things even today, and even on believers. Perhaps even especially on believers. And that fact can be verified throughout the Old Testament, when God's people are constantly pursuing the worldly pleasures and the worldly pursuits. And God is constantly calling them back to Him and calling them and calling them and calling them, and they don't hear and they don't hear and they don't hear, and finally He said He thumps them on the head. And how many times were God's people rejected because of their consistent refusal and denial of Him? May that not be said of you. And if you're an unbeliever, we throw out terms in Christian circles sometimes that we understand fully, and those who aren't in the church, it's like we're speaking a foreign language. An unbeliever, unsaved, unchristian, whatever, it's a generic term for those who have not put their faith and trust in what Jesus did when He died on the cross for their sins, for my sins and for your sins. You will have lost fruit. And you will be amongst those who look and see as Babylon, whatever this is, it goes down in flames. And you will bemoan all the glories that you've had and the good times you've had that will no longer ever be available. May you turn to Jesus now before it's eternally too late. Let's pray. God, I pray just for those who right now are watching this, that you would bring conviction upon those who do not know you. Those who have embraced the world's lifestyles, the world's materialism, the world's immorality, the things, Lord, that go against your word. And they have put those things in place of you. Lord, I pray for those who may not even see a problem with this, those who have never been exposed to the idea that this could be a problem. Lord, I pray that as your Spirit brings conviction on them for the sins in which their lives are entangled, that you would just cause them, Lord, to reach out even now. Or there are many at Village Bible Church right now who would love to share with them the way to salvation, the way they can know for sure that they won't have to face these things that we've just read this morning. That they can know for sure they won't have to face the eternal condemnation and separation and lake of fire in hell. Lord, I pray for those who may be scoffing at even the thought of all these things I've said. They seem like fairy tales. They seem like nonsense. They seem unverifiable. God, I pray that you would bring just truth to their lives, that they would not reject this truth. And Lord, that as we see foreshadowings, types and shadows of what is to come already playing out before us, Lord, with this pandemic and with other things, the riots going on right now, Lord, we see these are foreshadowings of what is to come at the end. Lord, may these not be written off. Lord, may they be taken seriously, especially by those who have rejected you to this point. And Lord, I pray for the believers who are listening to this right now, that they would be encouraged to hang in there, to stay faithful. Lord, there are many who profess faith in Christ who are embracing many things that are completely antithetical to your word and to your plan. And they're doing so in the name of love and in the name of biblical authority. God, I pray that your Holy Spirit would bring deep conviction upon those folks. Lord, that the church that has forsaken you would be brought back to you. Pray that the church that, like Laodicea, that has embraced worldly goods and pursuits, wealth and materialism, just the prosperity gospel. Lord, that those folks would turn to you. I pray for the folks at Village Bible Church that you would continue to help us, Lord, to be bold in our proclamation of faith, that we would live it out. We would not be hypocrites, Lord, but that we would live what we see in your word, completely surrendered to you. Lord, that it may never be said of us that we are lukewarm, nor that we are cold, but that we are on fire for you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thank you again for joining with us this morning. I hope that that God has spoken to you through his word. Look forward to you joining us again next week as we get into Revelation 19. And then also, again, if you'd like to join with us on Wednesday evening, we'll be doing a prayer meeting. This week, is it this week? Yes. This week, we'll be doing a shorter prayer meeting, 30 minutes from 6:30 to 7. Then at 7 o'clock, we'll be joining with evangelical free churches across America to go through the Lord's Prayer together for 30 minutes. So hopefully you'll join us then. If not on Zoom, you can look up that connection on Facebook and YouTube at 7 o'clock Wednesday evening. So we'll look forward to seeing you again this week.